Okay, welcome everybody. I am very excited today to introduce to you Rilla Askew. She is with the English department at Oklahoma University, and she teaches creative writing, which I'm excited to be doing now as well. But she's been doing this for longer, and she is also an author, and she has many, many wonderful things to talk with us about today regarding writing and novels and short stories and all aspects in this world, this realm, this subculture of writing and writers. And so I'm super excited to have her here today. I was telling her before we got started that I felt a little intimidated, but we're good now. And I'm going to set that aside and we're just going to have a lovely conversation. And I'm hoping that there will be many good nuggets of information for you in here that you can draw from and use as you all continue into your writing adventure. So with that, I'm going to ask Rilla to share with us right off the bat here. How did you get started writing? What inspired your love to communicate through the written word?
I began actually with acting. So before I began to write, I was an actor and I went to New York to act. And there's a kinship between acting where you embody another character in your whole being, and what we do as fiction writers, where we embody character in our heads and with language. And as readers, we do the same thing. We live inside characters. So there is a connection there. After I got to New York, I found the business of acting, making of a career of acting really, really challenging. And I began just straight away to write. You know, with acting, you have to have the job before you can practice the art. I mean, you can take acting classes, but if you really want to get up and act, you've got to have the play, you've got to have the production, you've got to have the job.
Right.
With writing, anybody can write anytime, anywhere. All you need is something to write upon and something to write with. That's it. And that's really where it began for me, was that urge to create, that urge to embody character and understand others' lives, which I also enjoyed doing through the medium of acting. But the freedom that writing gives you, that you're all, and this is one of the things that I sometimes talk with my students about at the moment at which we begin to say, I am a writer, as opposed to I want to be a writer or I want to write. I am a writer. And it's not publication. It's not, one doesn't have to be published in order to be a writer. And that transition is a long process for a lot of people, but claiming that and being able to do it and being free to do it is really where it began for me. And then maybe for a couple of years, I tried to do both, some acting and some writing on my own. I got a lot of encouragement from my husband, which was really a huge help, because if one person believes in you, one friend, one mate, one teacher, one parent, one brother, one person, then it validates for us something that we need to understand, that we can do this thing.
Absolutely.
And then I eventually devoted myself full-time to writing and went back to school, as you did, went back to school after being out for a number of years, to an MFA, a Master of Fine Arts writing program at Brooklyn College. And it was there that I began to teach as well. And it was in the process of teaching that I discovered many, many things, and that went beyond my ambitions as a writer. And much of this had to do with conditions of race and racism in America. This was Brooklyn in the late 1980s, early 1990s. There was much racial tension. Almost all my students were young people of color. They taught me so much. And it was because
my husband grew up in Brooklyn.
Yeah. Which part? Do you know?
I don't know. He's very Italian. Well, he's Italian Irish.
Might have been Carroll Gardens, which is actually where I lived, which was a very Italian neighborhood. In any case, very quickly, just to say that the first thing, I'd been writing stories, short stories, and many of them grounded in Oklahoma and my experience growing up in Oklahoma, in small town Oklahoma, which I grew up in Bartlesville, but my family's from Red Oak, when we talk about Southeastern Oklahoma, and that's where I spent all my summers. So that's where I began writing. But then other elements of my life took me more and more to to the story of white racism in this country, which led me to learning for the first time about the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Yes.
So as with many people who grew up in Oklahoma in that era, never knew anything about it, never heard about it.
Right.
And I learned about it by reading a biography of the great Black novelist, Richard Wright. That's where I first heard about it. And then I knew I wanted to write about it. And so we'll come, I suppose, in a bit to the conversation about doing research and writing.
Yes.
And so when I wanted to write about it, of course, I had to do a tremendous amount of research. So the first thing that led me to writing novels was also looking at uncovering really large issues. So more than only character, more than only story, or more than only my own autobiography. And so therefore I had to learn the facts as well as I could, the truth of what happened as well as I could, and then render that within character and so forth. So that's a much more complex issue, but that's what led me to writing novels.
Mm-hmm.
So it was wanting to express myself, moving from acting to writing short stories, and being in a writing community in an MFA program, to knowing that I wanted to write novels because novels were what I loved to read. I love short stories too, but I love to just immerse myself for days in a good, big, thick, juicy,
yes,
historical novel.
Yes.
My fave.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I know that feeling. I love Gothic, historical,
yeah,
the old stories. Victoria Holt was a favorite of mine for a long time. I liked how she twisted mystery and romance together. And I think I read every single one of her novels. It was a ridiculous obsession for a long time, but
we get off on those obsessions, don't we? Yeah,
absolutely. You've got to read everything by this person and then everything by that person. And it is, I started loving telling stories, I think in about 7th grade. And I had a teacher, Miss Campbell, who she would challenge us with different creative writing prompts. And they just like woke my brain up. And I'm good at this, and it was a lot of fun. For me, it started.
It is a journey for all of us. And some people know very young, as you did, that they want to write. And some people don't. I was in my 30s by the time I realized that this is really who I am and what I do. Mm-hmm. So and I think that there are others who come to it even much later in life. Yes. So there's no time limit on becoming a writer. If you want to be a gymnast, got to start pretty young. But to be a writer, you can start any age.
Right. I think that's wonderful. I was talking to Joshua Danker-Dake recently. He's one of the authors here from Tulsa. And he said that he considers even the time that he spends thinking about his stories and thinking of ideas, he considers that writing too. And I said, I like
part
that
of the process. It is, although I tell you, I have to say to my students all the time, thinking about writing is not writing, because now it's totally a part of the process. It's, it really is a part of all of it, that those wonderful ideas you get standing in the shower, or walking the dog, or running the vacuum cleaner, all those places that we get those ideas really matter. But if we don't ever get it on the page, if we don't ever get it into the computer, we really haven't written it. So I can't, every time I say that in a workshop or something, I see how my students going. They go, I know, because I had such great ideas for this, but it's actually, it's late. I haven't turned it in yet. So I agree in principle, but only that thinking about writing is part of the writing process, but thinking about writing is not writing. Only writing is writing.
You've got to put the pen to the paper.
You do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I was going to say, you touched on something too with, as with my one teacher, that it just takes one person. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it just takes one person to push you to that jumping point, to jump off of the diving board and to jump into those waters. And we have to have people around us who are going to be encouraging.
I agree.
And honest. Very honest is important.
Not merely flattering.
Exactly. No, that's just, if they're just flattering, run. Don't take that advice. But I was in my MFA program, and it was a short fiction writing class, and he had us write about something that frightened us as children. And so the practice, of course, was digging in and going into that dark emotional place, and then being unafraid to put all of that in writing. And I wrote about my childhood nightmare that I had on a regular basis because it was something that terrified me. And I dug in, I turned off the light, I dug in, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and kind of crafted it up and turned that in. And his comment to me changed my life. He said, Dacia, you have to get this published in a horror magazine. And I went, me? Really? And he said, absolutely. And I did. And it was the first thing I ever had published. And had he not done that, I wouldn't have had that oomph at that time to
try it. Yeah.
For it. And I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful today, but absolutely. I like you said that, it made me immediately go to that thought, but I'm so grateful for that one person who was willing to say, do this. How far, how high, and that's sometimes all it took. And that's exciting. It is absolutely very exciting. So, and we get to be that person for a lot of our students. And that's
true.
Kind of that turnaround now that puts us in that position of creative writing teachers. And so I hope we've had conversations because my class that I'm teaching is strictly online. And so all of commentary and critique and everything is happening in a strictly online fashion. And so it's all over discussion threads, which I know that you understand. I'm frustrated with that format because I like face-to-face.
Absolutely. Me too. Yeah. It works for some people, but it doesn't work for me. I really like the give and take and I feel that sometimes, even when I'm working with students work, I really prefer to meet with them than give written comments, because written comments are good because you can go back and look at them later, but they are a pronouncement.
Yes.
It is, no matter how you try to couch it, it still sounds as if you are giving directions.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily always most productive for the writing process. So
I agree.
So I agree with you. If at all impossible, I'd much rather be in person.
I would very much prefer that. Hint, hint, wink, wink to anybody who might see this.
Yeah, the pandemic will be over someday, and then we'll have more options.
Right. But I find myself offering critiques to students, and it's difficult without having them in front of me to get a broader picture of who they are as individuals, so that the critiques can be, as you said, we're going to make them more focused and make them more for that particular individual to encourage them in one way or the other. And it makes it a very strange animal when it's completely online, but do what we can and we make do, and we focus on the creative writing aspect and digging into the emotional palette and the five senses is something that I really push. Is that something that you teach?
Oh yeah, sensory detail. That's the only way to really evoke it in the reader. We deeply respond to what we can see, smell, taste, hear, feel.
Do you have any particular tips or tricks in that area that you find helpful for helping students understand how to get out of themselves and to be focusing on those things?
No, I don't actually, other than to keep repeating that and to give really good examples of, and also in response to something that comes into the workshop where we can, point out where the sensory details or point out where we don't even know where we are in physical space because somebody's seeing it in their own head, but they forgot to put it on the page. So I think, John Gardner was the first writing teacher that I read. I didn't, by the time I started writing, he was already gone. It was just about the same time. I think he died in 82. But his wonderful book, he had a couple of really wonderful books, one on writing fiction and one on moral fiction. But he talks about creating the fictional dream and how it is that fictional dream lived in the mind of the reader. It's lived in the mind of the writer. They put it on the page, it's translated, and it becomes in the mind of the reader, and how all that is done with sensory detail.
Yes.
And so I think there's a kind of shorthand that we have increasingly now in terms of storytelling. So young people who have, grown up where most of the stories that they encounter are film and television. and all of the jump cuts and the shorthand that we have in terms of that language. And sometimes even now I can't watch a film that was made like even in the 1990s. I'm like, we got it. You don't have to show us, we don't need to see him driving all the way over there. Just like, open the door and he's there. So right. I think a lot, especially young writers, do this a great deal. And I think a lot of contemporary American fiction is moving that direction. Mm-hmm. But it's the very particular sensory detail, the very specific one that evokes all of it, that gives us that whole scene without a long wordy description. And it really does happen primarily within the senses and within language. So the telling detail, the relevant detail, and putting those within the five senses, it's just something that I emphasize a lot. But I think that students, that's an abstraction when you're just trying to do it. For me, when I was learning from John Gardner, that was a principle that he, that I learned from him, and then I just practiced it.
Right.
But that was even in a time when, I was reading Faulkner. Well, there's just like a whole lot of detail there, a whole lot of sensory detail.
Right.
And abstractions. But I think where that's most productive is when students can see it in their own work, and even better when they can see it in workshop in a fellow writer's work, the difference that it makes when we can suddenly put ourselves in the scene and put ourselves inside the head of the character because the writer has evoked that. And it's good to have the many wonderful published stories that are out there that are wonderful examples. But this thing that we were speaking about earlier, where we think that writers are somehow way up there, way out there. We don't, like they're almost like created by God, or like, sprung fully formed from Zeus's forehead, like Athena. And that's of course not the case. It is a learning process. And many of us, most people who go on to become writers were very much readers in the beginning.
Yes.
First of all, we were readers, then we became writers, then we learned the craft.
Yes.
And got better and better at it. And then eventually learn our subject, what it is that we have to write about, and begin to get published and all those other things. It is a long process, but the thing that happens in workshop or a classroom where we can see other writers who are our peers doing that. And when we can see, it's not here in that person's story because they didn't tell it to me, it's not on the page, and it is here in this person's story because they put it on the page. And then I say, so I'm going to put it on the page,
right.
And so I think that's one of the most helpful things for student writers.
I miss workshopping. That was my favorite part of going through that program, was sitting and listening, reading other people's work, and then listening to everybody discuss the work all together. You gain so much insight and so many ideas from other people's work.
Exactly. That's what I didn't understand when I first started a workshop. I thought I wanted to hear what everybody had to say to me. I thought they were going to tell me about my work, and that was going to change everything for me. And of course, that is a part of it. But I learned so much more by what I was able to give them, how I was learning to read their work and articulate what was working and not working in somebody else's story. And you don't sort of realize that at first, or I didn't anyway. I just, I wouldn't, it's me, tell me about mine, and then but I have to tell them about theirs because those are the terms of the course. And then after a time, you begin to realize how much you're learning.
Oh, it became such a vital function for me. I tell the students that it changed my life in the sense that prior to jumping into workshopping sessions, I had pretty thin skin. And the first time I was a participant in a workshop event during my MFA program, I went home in tears. It hurt me and it made me angry. And I thought, I can't do this.
I think we all come in with, if you come into a workshop and you've never been in one before and you're not thin-skinned, I don't know. I don't even know if that exists, but you develop that tough skin. Yes. And you learn to receive what is really helpful.
Yes.
And reject what isn't, so you don't have to take everything everyone says, but the jewels, the gems, you take them.
They're definitely there. And like you said, it's not just from what you receive from others about your own, it's what you're seeing in other people's work. You start to recognize their skill, and you can draw from that. And it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. I've encouraged the students that when they finish this course, they need to get involved in a writing group, whether they create one of their own or they, search in Tulsa for a group like Tulsa Night Writers, but to get involved. And if you want to be a writer, you've got to connect with other writers. I feel like it's an essential function for writers to not be alone in that. I mean, you do write by yourself.
That's enough aloneness right there.
But we've got to share. We absolutely have to share with each other and learn from each other. And I told them that there's like a whole subculture out there of writers that you aren't aware exists until you step into that realm. After my MFA was complete, I was suffering because I missed it so much. And so I found a writing group in St. Louis and got heavily involved. And it was incredible.
I'm going to tell you, I'm getting a signal that my internet connection is unstable. So if I end up disappear, I won't disappear by my voice and I won't go off. But if my video stops, that's probably what's happened, and I'll just go off for a bit until it settles down. So I'm just letting you know that may happen because I'm getting that signal. It might freeze a little bit. So
I had a question. I was just curious as we were talking. I wondered, do you remember what the first novel was that you read that made you think, I love this? Like stories
I think
you needed.
Yeah, I think it was Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers. Well, two, that one and Alice Walker's The Color Purple.
Okay.
And I read them around the same time. And
Okay.
I remember putting down The Color Purple and just weeping because of her relationship with her sister at the end. And then also just all these other layers of, racism, sexism, all those other things that the novel is dealing with that were so powerful and moving for me. And Member of the Wedding, I think it's just because I just loved Frankie. She was the wild girl of my heart. I don't know that I ever acted like her, but I felt like her. And that's the thing. It's where it's a book that makes me feel. And there've been many, many since, but I would have to say that those two, which I read sort of around the same time, very early on, they didn't come out at the same time. I remember The Wedding had been out for decades. I just hadn't read it yet. So,
Right.
And The Color Purple I read when it first came out. In any case, those, I would say that it is about that. It's where a book can reach inside my heart and just, pull it. And I can read what that character's doing. And I just say, I just being moved by it, because it isn't always an identification like that's me, but it's that I understand the human condition more richly, and I feel it more acutely.
Yes.
Because of living it with these characters.
Oh, I like the way you said that. You're living it with the characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely. For me, it was Wuthering Heights.
Yeah.
And that was in 7th grade. I was able to navigate through that in the 7th grade. I mean, everything was that year. That year was a massive year for me as far as falling in love with reading and writing. And I've never forgotten that novel. And I feel like my life has mimicked that novel throughout time. And I am Kathy. And I have been Kathy, and I've been in Kathy's situations. And I have, like you said, I've been she's that wild girl inside of me. And I tried to tame it just like she did. And it just didn't work. So I identified with it. Even in 7th grade, it was almost like foreknowledge, or maybe I caused the events of my life in some way.
Or predictive, yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. I just thought that might be a fascinating thing to ask you. So would you say that The Color Purple then had influence on you in the things that you would then eventually write about?
Oh, yeah. I would say that it did.
Mm-hmm.
And also Alice Walker, a number of her essays and her personal essays, which we didn't in those days call creative nonfiction, but that's really what they are. And after I started teaching at Brooklyn College, I would teach a number of her essays. But in terms of what it made me feel and begin to recognize
Mhm.
of stories, of people's stories that I didn't understand. That there's so many things there's so many layers of ignorance that growing up white in this country puts upon us, and that we have to break through. And one powerful way that helps us break through that is art, and in myriad art forms. But for me, it was always fiction. And so I would say that I didn't know that at the time, certainly, but and then, later when I began to read James Baldwin, he probably is the single most powerful influence on me as a writer, not that I know of in a direct way, but elements that I understand about America, which is really what I'm always writing about, come from the richness and complexity and beauty of his writing, both his fiction and nonfiction, but especially his nonfiction.
Okay.
So, yeah, those things are all a part of the whole, but one book opens you up to an entire, how many African-American writers had I ever even read before The Color Purple? I can't even think, I'm sure, I read Invisible Man, but Invisible Man affected me intellectually. It didn't affect me in my gut, in my heart, in my feelings, in the same way that Color Purple did back in the time. So I don't know, it's all myriad, mixed together now, but I do know that yes, a book can change your life.
Yes.
A bit of writing can change, can set you on a trajectory that you're not even aware of when it happens.
Absolutely. That's really beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful. That's a question I think I'm going to start asking from this point forward always. What book influenced you? I think that's a fascinating one, because I do. For me, it definitely was Wuthering Heights, but I love that for you it was The Color Purple, because I'm familiar with what you have written, and that makes sense. That makes sense. So, and so Rilla does write historical fiction, and very much is jumping into several different aspects there with the focus in Oklahoma. Can you tell us a little bit about historical fiction and why historical fiction, and then some of the research techniques that you may have, just some ideas there?
Happy to do that. So as I've mentioned, one of the things that I was really writing about was race in America. And when I learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre, I knew that I wanted to write about it. And it did not occur to me to want to write about it in nonfiction. I do write some nonfiction now, but then did not. And knew that I wanted to write a novel that would investigate not only what happened, but the conditions that led to what happened with the assault on Greenwood. And I think your audience doesn't need to be told what that story is, especially for your students there in Tulsa. But in that day, in 1989, when I first learned about it, 1990, when I first began to research it, the history was absolutely suppressed. I couldn't even begin to find out what did happen. It took me a long time to uncover even the actual events of the massacre. And Scott Ellsworth's wonderful book, Death in a Promised Land, had been published. But if you can imagine, this was pre-internet. Right. This was, when I started doing this research, we didn't have, pre-internet for everybody. We didn't just get online and look something up. I had to lived in Brooklyn, but I had to come back to Oklahoma and go to the Tulsa City County Library. The newspaper files were gone from those dates.
Yes.
And so I ended up going. After a while, it took me a while to uncover that where I needed to go was to the Ralph Ellison Library in Oklahoma City, where the archives for the Black newspapers at that time were all kept. And it was there reading issues of the Black Dispatch, Roscoe Dungee's amazing Oklahoma-based newspaper, that I uncovered for the first time what really happened with the massacre. So, but it took 11 years for me to research and write and uncover the facts. Right. And so when I was speaking of Scott Ellsworth, who was from Tulsa and went to primary sources, he went to survivors and their descendants to find out what really happened. The book was and the book had been published by University Press, I believe, in Louisiana, but it wasn't available everywhere. It's not like you could walk into a bookstore and get it the way you can get his new book, The Groundbreaking. It was much harder. Well, I just didn't even know about it.
Right.
I didn't know that it existed. So I went to all the primary sources to find it out, but I also came to understand. So I'm a fifth generation Oklahoman, long identified with that. My family came, as white immigrants into Choctaw Nation, it was still Indian territory, when, as far as I can tell, they had no real legal right to own land. So they were like, I don't know that you'd call them squatters, but they were certainly illegal immigrants.
Right.
And for both sides of my family, came from Mississippi and Kentucky, settled in Southeastern Oklahoma and Choctaw Nation, what was Indian territory then. Yes. And so I have this deep identification, but I didn't know any of those stories. I didn't know how my family got to Oklahoma. I didn't know how African-American people came to Oklahoma. I knew the land runs and the Trail of Tears. That's it. So I had to go back and really try to understand what this was. And I wanted to know it through the lens of my own family. So I started writing what became Fire in Beulah, started this story, a narrative between a white woman and her African-American maid who worked for her, because I wanted to tell the story from women's eyes, the sense that women make and are made by history as well. It's not just men who do that or live through historical upheaval. I wanted to tell those two sides of the story. And the only way, because segregation was so severe and so fierce in that time, the first laws enacted by the Oklahoma State Legislature were Jim Crow laws of segregation, that the only way these two women would be in touch with each other would be if one were the employer and one were the employee, because they wouldn't have been friends. They wouldn't have been church friends, co-workers, somebody from down the street at all. The lives were completely segregated. So doing a deep dive into what I knew the segregation in the era I grew up in Bartlesville, and I knew the severity of it, and I knew the biases that I was raised to have. But I starting to go look at those newspaper archives and beginning to understand the absolute depth of it, the absolute violence of it, the absolute force of it in early Oklahoma was devastating, difficult, and I wanted to write about that. But I also wanted to know, how did that get carried into Indian territory? That's what I did not know. And so I went back into my own family story and began to research the one side of my family, which was the Askews, who came from Kentucky into Choctaw Nation in the late 1800s. So I started the novel Fire in Beulah. I put it aside and went back to the late 1800s because I was going, this is how we were in 1921.
Right.
Why were we this way? And Hilary Mantel, wonderful historical novelist, says, beneath every history, another history. And that's exactly what it is. So you can't understand what happened in 1921 if you don't understand what went before.
That's right.
And you can't understand what conditions right now. You can't understand George Floyd unless you understand 1921. I mean, you have to know the whole story. This is my view. And certainly if you're a novelist and you're wrestling with these issues, you have to tell it as frankly and as truthfully as you can. Yes. And so you have to know all that. Right. Going back into my own family story and coming to understand how they came into Indian territory took me into the novel, The Mercy Seat. So as it happened, though I set out, first of all, to write about the race massacre, I had to write The Mercy Seat first. And come to understand what forces were brought in they're very much fictional. They're not really, it's very loosely based on the family stories and very much imaginative, very Faulkner influenced, I know. And so trying to get all that right and trying to get how they lived right and trying to get how they saw the world right was the first task. So that became that novel. And then when I finished The Mercy Seat, I was able to go ahead and finish the book about the Tulsa Race Massacre, which became Fire in Beulah. So that's part of why I say 11 years from when I first learned about it until the book was published. But there was a time in the middle where I was going back into my own family story to understand how these elements were brought into Indian territory.
Are the two novels connected in the sense that
There's a character who becomes a lost brother in the mercy seat, and he becomes a secondary character, the character named Jim D in Fire and Beulah, but you'd almost have to really know my work to know that. I don't think he changes his last name to Logan, and his name was Lodi, and so unless you really, I know he's the same character, but unless you really have studied my work, I don't think you would really get that. So no, they're not overtly connected.
So this is something that you've touched on here that I want to just speak on, because I have some students who we are in the middle of a writing project right now. And some of them found, once they got about a week into the writing project, it's a month long, 20,000 words over a period of 4 weeks. About a week in, they realized this isn't the story I'm supposed to tell right now. And several put that aside and jumped into a new project, this idea that like just hung on them that they had to write. And so I appreciate you saying that, because I want them to know you're normal.
It happens. Yeah. And that one thing leads you to a deeper and richer understanding of what it is that you really do have to write about, or that it has to be written first and you have to investigate it in writing before you're able to write the other.
Sometimes we have ideas that we're just not ready for.
And sometimes they're just not worthy ideas. I have another story. I started to write about, so for my third novel, which is the novel that became Harp Song, but I had finished Mercy Seat, I had finished and published Fire and Beulah, and I was working on a novel about a young girl that was sort of based on a character that I had developed in some short stories for my very first book, Strange Business. And so she was a teenage girl living in Bartlesville. It was a lot of autobiographical elements.
Right.
And I kept struggling with it. And I was maybe 100 pages into it. It just wasn't going anywhere. And I realized there was nothing that was going to happen to this girl that was going to be interesting enough to me to want to spend 300 pages and, 3 years writing about. Right. But I had invested a lot in it. And so one day I went for a walk. I lived in the Catskills then, and I went for a walk. There was a swamp down at the end of our road. And so we would always walk down to the swamp. That was like our goal. It was like half a mile or something. And all the way to the swamp, I kept saying, you're going to have to give that up. You're just going to, and then I would go, no, but I've already written so much on it and I've already put so much work in it. And then I would just like, yeah, but I'm really bored with it. But when I got to the swamp, I finally just like let the story go. I just kind of went, okay, I'm not doing it. I'm just giving it up. I'm going to start on something else. And I didn't have any idea what it was going to be or anything. And then as I just started walking home from the swamp, a voice started talking in my head that was absolutely the opening lines of Harp Song. Wow. Where a young woman saying, there was a postcard that was on my bulletin board of a couple of hitchhikers during the Great Depression, and a young woman and a young man. And it was just that image that was in my head. And I heard her voice saying, that's me and him standing outside by the side of the road outside Joplin, Missouri. And it just went from there. So you have to sometimes get rid of what's not working in order to allow the thing in that is working.
Joplin, huh?
Joplin, yeah.
I went to college in Joplin. I know the area well. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Excited. So is the story centered in that area, or is it?
No, it's another Oklahoma story. No, but they traveled around during the Great Depression. So she talks about it. She says, you wouldn't even know where it was. It just looks like any place else in America. It could even be Oklahoma or anywhere. She just happens to remember it was Joplin. But they traveled all over, but the main events of the novel all take place in Oklahoma. So I was still trying to uncover Oklahoma's story, as I've been doing for a long time.
Well, as we're talking like this, I got hit by an idea that I've never considered before, but just talking about the different people groups that have come to Oklahoma and the stories that are in Oklahoma and the whys behind the different, this happened, but this happened before it. And so McAllister, where I grew up, is a coal mining town originally. And it was settled by Italian miners. And the street where I grew up, it's a block from a cemetery, an old, decrepit cemetery. And I played there that's where I played as a little girl. And I tell people that's what's wrong with me.
That's where all the Gothic impulses came from,
It
right?
really is. I more than likely it really is. But one of the things I've always loved about that cemetery is there's a massive grave marker for I don't remember how many, but there was a large number of miners that lost their lives at one time. And wow, how incredible would it be to dig into their story, their lives?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And then
well, that particular novel, Harp Song, ends with a huge event that happened in McAllister, which is historical. So it's in the novel, it's it's told from the characters' points of view. But during the Great Depression, out of work coal miners and their wives and children took over the courthouse, that same courthouse that's there on Carl Albert to this very day, and did what we would call a sit-in, what they would have called in the 60s a sit-in. They took over the courthouse and occupied it, demanding money for food and and for food and jobs.
Right.
So there was a strong activist impulse with those coal miners down in that part of the country.
I've never thought about that before. Not until we were starting to have this conversation. I was, oh my goodness, because that's always been a part of my life. It's always been in the background because I played there. I played on top of their grave. Sick, but yes.
Yeah, there were lots of people died. They were some of the most dangerous coal mines in the country because there was so much natural gas and so little regulation.
Yes, and as a result of
terrible in Wilburton,
some of the
terrible.
best food in Oklahoma now from the Italian families that remained there. So if anybody ever gets an opportunity to go to Pete's Place or Alla Capri or Rosanna's, take that opportunity.
Krebs, yeah,
right there in Krebs. But you mentioned the courthouse. In my novel, A Kiss in the Rain, it's loosely set in McAllister, and the Busby Theater. Do you remember the Busby Theater, which was right behind the courthouse? There's a portion of it that centers around the Busby Theater. When I was a little girl, our church met in that building, and it was beautiful. I remember so many elements of that building and the stories that the courthouse used to be a hotel. And so in my story, it centers around a woman who was a stage actor, and she would go in the tunnels underneath between the hotel and the theater. And I love that area.
Somebody told me, I know I'm going to say this one last McAllister story, and then we're going to come back and talk about novels, because actually I don't think your students care about these stories, but I'm just guessing. But somebody told me that became the Busby was the first opera house built west of the Mississippi, and they tore it down and put in a parking lot. Yes, and that is so Oklahoma. I can't stand it. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. Let's talk about novels.
I lived there when they did that. Awful. And that's part of my story, is that it's gone. And so there's irritation there. But this is part for what the students, they need to think about things from their lives and incorporate things from their lives into their stories, and study, research. Let ideas just come from out of nowhere. I love that you were walking to a swamp and back. I think that's amazing, because we need to just be open to the ideas as they come. And so at this point, we have been talking for almost an hour already, and I knew this would happen. I knew that we would just be having a conversation, and I think that's wonderful. But I do want to ask you in particular about a writing process. Do you have a particular way that when you sit down to start writing, do you have a process that you follow?
The most important thing for me, especially when I'm working on a novel, is that I get up and go straight to the computer the first thing in the morning. I mean, in my case, with my second cup of coffee, because if I let the world come in, I cannot visit that fictional place. This is really true now in this era of social media, but this was true before, well before that became such a temptation to go check your social media.
Yes.
And so I have to really block the world out. And for myself, now some writers do it late at night, and that's where they can go find their way to, to that fictional world where we're living with the words and the images inside our head and listening to the sound of rhythms and voices inside our head. For me, it has to happen early in the morning. I have to go from the dream state to that state. And I have to do it every day. When I'm working on a novel, if one day away means 2 days back, You leave it for one, it leaves you for two. That is always the case for me. If I'm not doing it every day and I take a break, life circumstances get in the way.
Right.
It takes such a long time to get back immersed in the book.
Mhm.
This is really the case for writing a novel because it's such a long process, and you have to, you have to give it
Right.
time, and you have to give it that attention every day. Writing shorter pieces, especially like flash nonfiction, you can sit down and do it in a set, one sitting, and then come back and revise it. The most recent short story I did over the course of a weekend.
Mhm.
So that is when I'm working in shorter, and also working with creative nonfiction, which I do pretty often. I can leave it and return to it because I don't need to be in a fictional dream
Mhm.
while I'm working on those things. Those are language, they're discipline oriented. I can pull myself back from some other place and
Right.
enter that and develop my ideas and so forth. So they're just different animals. And I think that one of the things, I don't know if this will be the case for your students, but one of the things that I find is that my students mostly read novels. They love novels, they read novels, but we're working in short stories because they lend themselves to the workshop format, and they haven't read very many short stories.
Right.
So they spend a great deal of time setting up the terms of the story. Don't jump right into it the way we do with short fiction.
Right.
But they're actually not writing a novel. They don't go on and finish it. So there's a wonderful book, by the way, I'll recommend to you, by Matt Bell, called Refuse to Be Done. It's just come out, and Matt Bell is the author of the wonderful novel Appleseed, and many others. But he talks a lot about, it's really about the process of writing a novel and the distinction. I mean, the whole book is about writing a novel that is not a how to do this, and this, but it's how to allow the novel to develop and bloom inside you. But one of the first things he says is that we tell ourselves, to every morning you get up and say, I am writing a novel. I am writing a novel, not I want to write a novel, or I think this might be a novel, or this is a short story might turn into a novel. I'm writing a novel. And then the commitment to the amount of time that it's going to take to do that is easier to validate. And then the other most important bit of writing advice I remember that's been most valuable to me is from John Steinbeck. He said, you have to give up the notion of ever finishing. When you're writing a novel, if you're looking to the end, it's a misery. You just have to be writing what I'm writing this day.
Right.
And that makes a huge difference for me, because when you get in that saggy middle, the loose, saggy, baggy middle, you can start like by gangbusters and you may know where it's going to end, and you have all that drama, but it's that middle that just wants to sag.
Right.
But, and hopefully your novel is not going to sag in the middle, but the writing of it can certainly feel like, and you can abandon it. So I think affirming that I'm writing a novel and that is all I'm doing. I'm not finishing a novel. I'm not trying to sell a novel. I'm not we are all fantasizing about actually selling the novel and all the attention you're going to get. But if you're only thinking that, you're never going to get there. You're just like, I'm writing these 3 pages this day.
Yeah.
And I think that's the best novel writing advice I have.
I love that. So we started out by telling yourself, I am a writer. I am a writer. And I am
writing a novel, or I'm writing a short story, or I'm writing a poem.
I'm writing an article.
Fiction.
That's lovely. We have to affirm ourselves. I do think that's lovely. I think that's definitely something that we all need to add to our repertoire every day. I like that. I am a writer. I am. And I've been saying that without even realizing that I've been saying that. But I am. Whether I do something with it today, as far as seeking publishing or not, I'm still writing. I'm doing it.
Exactly. That's it.
I love that. I feel like it's a driving force to be creating and to be expressing and putting words to paper. I love just.
And if you say it enough and you're not actually writing, then you're going to get really, really guilty, and then you're going to start writing. I've been telling myself I'm a writer. By gosh, I'm going to get up and write today.
I've been telling my students lately, because they've all been, since we're in the middle of this writing project, they're like, I had writer's block this week. And I'm like, then write about it. Write about your writer's block.
I have a story about that as well. So when I taught 1 year at Syracuse University when I was there as a visiting writer, and Tobias Wolff, marvelous short story and nonfiction writer, he's just amazing, was there at the time. So I had him come in and speak to my class. It was a fiction writing class of some sort, and he has kind of a gruff way of talking. It's the nature of his voice and so forth. He's a really generous person, and he's just amazing, both individual and writer. But he almost sounds like an army colonel or something like that. He did spend a lot of time in the military, or he has written about that. But in any case, one of the students asked him about writer's block, and he said, "Don't believe in it." Well, what do you mean you don't believe it? He didn't say there's no such thing, but he basically said, I don't believe in it. Yeah. And so somebody said, well, but people talk about it all the time. He said, you just have to be willing to write badly for a while.
That's right.
And that also is really freeing for me. Yes. Because when things, there are times that you're working and it is a complete failure of imagination and language, just dry as a bone. And the only way out is through. You have to write your way through it, and you have to be willing to write badly and to not come back and judge it and shut yourself down.
Right.
Because the only way to get to the other side of whatever that is to write your way through it.
That's right.
You're not going to think your way through it or affirm your way through it or, daydream your way through it. You can only write your way through it.
Well, I told them recently that, if you're struggling, write about your struggle. If you're upset, write about your upset. You don't know. Go back later on and look through that writing, and you might find some golden nuggets of emotion that you could give to a character, and use that at another time to fuel something. Use your frustration. If you feel like slamming things, write about it. Put those emotions on the paper. When you feel like you're hitting a wall, write about the wall.
All those things can work.
Absolutely. And you said Tobias Wolff. His short story Bullet in the Brain, I use it every semester.
Yeah, I love that story.
Oh, I do too. I think it is beautiful.
Brilliant.
I read it out loud to the students, and when I get to the end and I drag it out and kind of just make it as lovely as it deserves, they all just sit there and stare. Like, what did you just read? It's a lovely story. And then we pick it apart for rhetorical analysis. It's lovely. So I think your connection just slowed down.
Might have.
Yeah. Oh, you're back.
You're back. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. It was like you kind of paused and froze for a second. So that all is well. Well, this is, I have excellent material here. I am very appreciative. Is there anything else? There were some things we didn't even get to, and I don't think that that's a problem. I feel like we have.
Well, we can't get to everything. That's right.
Oh, we can't.
I do think, I don't think we can think our way to what our subject is. Mm-hmm. I mean, some people know, some people it's just intuitive. And for others, it's an uncovering and a discovery. But it just like the purported writer's block or any of the other self-sabotaging things that we do,
right?
Not knowing what we want to write about or what story we have to tell is another way that we can shut ourselves down and keep ourselves from going ahead and writing. And I think that it's the same thing with that we have to write our way to an understanding about what it is that we have to write, that, what stories that we have to tell, what our subject is. Mm-hmm. And that's an ongoing discovery, I think, for every writer.
I like that. I'm taking notes. Mm-hmm. I appreciate the opportunity to take notes. All right. Rilla, thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. It's really nice to visit with you and to discover the McCullers connection, which I didn't know about. Yeah. So that's great. And I hope your students get something from the conversation, and then
sure they will.
Again, just keep writing.
Yes, I'm sure
the main thing. Just keep writing.
And I'm going to post your website in the comments for
great.
them, and encourage them to pick up some of your books so that they can get an idea of the historical fiction that you write, and get to know some things about the area in which we live. Because I have a feeling some of them don't know about Tulsa
Very possibly.
21.
Yeah, or at least not the way that one receives it in the novel. So it's one thing, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to write about it in fiction, and why I feel that fiction is so important to hear facts.
Yes.
Over 1,000 homes and businesses, over 35 square blocks were destroyed in Greenwood. The amount of wealth and the numbers of people who were injured or dead. But when you've been living with characters for weeks or however long it's taken you to read to that point, then what happens to them is visceral for us as readers. And that's what Alice Walker, I suppose, gave me, and what, Carson McCullers and James Baldwin and so many others have given to the world as readers, Toni Morrison. I mean,
Right.
just keep thinking about how what happens inside the characters is the thing that we feel. And if you are interested in history, or you're interested in the moments of cataclysm that happen, or you're in, whatever your deep interest is, how that affects the humans, that's what we care about.
Yes.
And fiction can, and if you feel that you can rely on the history, this is one of the reasons I try to be as historically accurate as possible. You always make some mistakes, but really want to do that, because if you feel that you can rely on the history, then you're surrendered to what happens to the individuals in it.
Right.
It works on multiple levels. And so you feel that you sort of live the history vicariously that way, but you know it in a different way than if you just read facts and figures.
Yes.
In a book that purports to have no point of view, though all histories have a point of view, of course.
Absolutely. Let the reader live the history. Oh, I love that. I love that. You have to do service to history when you're going to write about it. I was gonna just tell the students real quick that Tulsa 1921 is the nonfiction book that we keep referencing. I cried as I read it. It's the events that took place here in Tulsa are shocking, devastating, and evil. And it's something that we all need to understand where we live.
Absolutely.
And what occurred here. And I appreciate you digging in, Rilla, and writing about it. And that was my first encounter with Rilla. She was on a panel of writers, authors who had written about the Tulsa Race Massacre through TCC. And I was among hundreds of others, faculty members and students and staff members who were listening to the panel discuss writing about the event. And I was touched, deeply touched at their efforts and the amount of research that they all did, because as she was saying earlier, there wasn't much information that was available without doing.
It was suppressed.
Yes.
It was suppressed. It was,
Yes.
it was, you couldn't find out about it.
Yeah.
And it was handed down in whispers in some, but many people didn't talk about it at all.
Personal accounts and at interviewing family members and being able to dig into, like you said, the Black newspapers, because any of the other newspaper information had been stricken. It was destroyed. And so
or it was just told from the
yes.
dominant white point of view. That's the other thing, which is that this was the biggest news story all across the nation. It would be, it was a huge news story. It was in every newspaper.
Yes.
So not all of those archives were just destroyed or taken away.
I think that the gentleman who was in that panel who was talking about that was talking about he did discover some microfiche. Didn't he?
I don't recall. That I don't necessarily remember. But I'm only talking about the Tulsa City County Library, and I'm only talking about, there were very specific archives removed from the Tulsa World and the Tulsa Tribune, which may be back there by now. And that happened, I was told, not at the library, but whoever was scanning in the newspapers before the actual hard copies of the newspapers at the newspaper offices before they were put on microfilm to send to the library. That's word of mouth. Somebody told me that's what. what happened with that. But that doesn't mean that so what I'm trying to say is that this suppression was also a collective decision to forget about it.
Yes.
And so that, everybody in the country knew about it. My grandparents had to have known about it. They were alive at that time in Southeastern Oklahoma.
Oh, sure.
Never a word said, handed down, especially in white families.
Yes.
So
Well,
anyway, that's a whole other topic. We can talk a long time about that.
We could, absolutely. But I am going to go ahead and let you go. And I so very much appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. And I know that there is going to be excellent information in here for the students to draw from, especially and to find encouragement. And I just appreciate
it. Happy writing to all you students as
yes,
well.
Absolutely.
Bye, Dacia. We'll be in touch. We'll talk later.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Rilla. Bye-bye.